Welcome students to Lecture 7 of MHHS 1. We've now visited 3 departments at UCR: Creative Writing, Hispanic Studies, and Theater, Film, and Digital Production, TFDP. We're now in week 4, so let's visit our 4th department by looking at the work of Antoine Lentacker in the History Department. Despite the disciplinary differences, there's actually a very smooth transition from Annika Speer's endorsement of embodied performance that we talked about in the last 2 lectures to Antoine Lentacker's theorization of what he calls the graphic performativity of the modern prescription that we'll explore in the next 2 lectures. So in both cases, the idea of performance shows up in perhaps unexpected places. You wouldn't expect, for example, acting to be important in issues about reproductive health care. And you wouldn't expect it to be important in a doctor just writing you a prescription for allergy medication. But both Speer and Lentacker are showing us how humanities training allows you to think critically about what Foucault called, quote, discourse in medical institutions that perform, for a lack of a better term, discourselessness. And see Lecture 1 for a refresher on Foucault and that kind of clinical discourse. So what we're hopefully learning by now is just to be less surprised by all of this. We're learning that medicine isn't just about the objective authority of and arrival at scientific truth. Performances, good and bad, around health and treatment have populated the stage of world history, and Lentacker gives us a tantalizing peek at a very, very particular moment at the end of the 19th century in France. So this lecture is going to give you a broad overview of Lentacker's case history of the late 19th century French prescription. So this first lecture will focus on the first and last sections of the essay. So it's going to be the ones titled, quote, On Graphic Performativity, and the final one called The Scripting Act. So I'll give you an overview of what Lentacker means by his phrase graphic performativity. Then I'll give you some more context about his framing theoretical interlocutor, J.L. Austin, on speech acts and power relations. And finally, I'll get to Lentacker's concluding section about the Scripting Act to think about the overall argument of the essay. So just a kind of contextual note here, by breaking it down, the essay this way, this lecture will also kind of model how to tackle longer academic articles, since this is our first lengthy reading assignment. So you might be overwhelmed by the density of the information and the argument here. So I just want to develop some reading strategies for you. The next lecture will zero in on Lentacker's dramatis personae of actors, the physician, the pharmacist, and the patient. But for now, however, I just want you to get the big picture argument first from Lentacker's introductory and concluding sections. I want you to notice first that Lentacker's essay about performativity has a kind of performativity itself. It begins with a narrative staging technique that you may know as a cold open or a teaser sequence. The classic example is in a James Bond movie that begins with, for example, an exciting car chase sequence, maybe featuring Bond driving really fast in an expensive car. And only after that exciting chase sequence is over do we get the splashy title of the movie and all the production information. So we go into that scene completely cold, without any expository information to warm us up first. So that's the cold of that cold open. Rather than bogging you down with kind of in-the-weeds definitions and theoretical explanations, Lentacker cold opens on the scene of Paul Bruardel, who is at once a, quote, stern avatar of the professional medical class and someone who, quote, enjoyed an occasional night out at the theater. So just in that cold open, that entertaining tension of stern erudition and relaxed enjoyment in that very first sentence sets the stage for the conflicts to come. In his night out, Bruardel encountered a fun stage scene in which a non-medical man has to pretend to be a doctor and write up a prescription for a young woman who gets sick. Everything turns out all right, however, since the prescription medication actually works. Brodel was so entertained by this scene he saw at the theater that he relayed the story to his medical students. But, as Lentacker notes, the moral of the story is actually quite unclear. Did Brodel want his students to take away from this that prescriptions are mostly nonsense, or that prescriptions enact a kind of palliative, soothing authority even if they are nonsense? It's unclear, right? This, I suppose, would be what we now call the placebo effect, the weird phenomenon of someone getting better just because they think they should be getting better. In drug trials, we now test this by giving subjects useless sugar pills and just seeing if they experience any psychophysiological reactions. And if they do, that's considered the placebo effect. Brodel's ultimate lesson is unclear, but what Lentacker wants us to focus on is the prescription's symbolic power that we see enacted on that vaudeville stage. And this is when we get a definition of his key phrase, graphic performativity. He begins not by telling us what the phrase is, but first telling us what it is not. So it is not about the power of speech as something inherent in speech itself. It is not just that certain words, when combined, produce a kind of magisterial authority, a kind of coherence, and a kind of brilliance. It isn't really just the words themselves, but the power relations among the speakers and the addressees. But it also is not just about power relations of those speakers and addressees, but about the media technologies that are used to communicate those words. All right, so we know what it's not. Only after all of this throat clearing about what graphic performativity is not can Lentacker actually say what it is. So it is not just about speech as something that has authority itself, and it is not just about the authors of that speech. It is about, number one, power relations among speakers and addressees, and number two, the media that deliver those words. So we know that this essay is about the actors of this performance and the technologies, paper pads, typewriters, stamps, etc., that facilitate that performance. So there's the actor component, that's the performativity part, and then there's the media component, that's the graphic part. So hence this term, graphic performativity. To understand these two components, to Lentacker's idea of graphic performativity, the graphic part and the performativity part, I want to give you more of a background on his main theoretical interlocutor, J.L. Austin. Now, Austin was a 20th century philosopher of language who is best known for his speech act theory, most fully developed in his book, How to Do Things with Words, published in 1962, a posthumous collection of his university lectures from the 1950s. So, how does a philosopher of language fit into this medical history? Seems kind of strange. Let's start with Lentacker's first part about what graphic performativity is not. So he says, quote, "The first mistake would be to locate the powers of performative speech in speech itself, rather than in the relations of powers." So this is in reference to Austin's big contribution to the philosophy of language. A certain group of scholars studying linguistics believed that language had what is known as truth value, something intrinsic to the sentence that can be true or false. For example, going back to a previous lecture, let's examine the sentence, "The square root of 2 is irrational." So that sentence is true. And in that previous lecture, we actually proved that that sentence is irrefutably true. And the sentence, "The square root of 2 is rational," is false. We proved that as well, beyond any reasonable doubt. Austin noticed, however, that most ordinary sentences are actually not like this. It's usually not so easy to assign conditions of truth and falsity to our statements. Instead, there are what he called conditions of felicity, a phrase that Lentacker quotes from Austin that make a sentence do what it's supposed to do, felicitous, or fail to do what it's supposed to do, infelicitous. So that's where the title "How to Do Things with Words" comes from. He noticed that most sentences are not about abstractly saying something true or false, but about doing something in the world. The famous example that Austin gives is about making a promise. So for example, if I say, I promise to go to your birthday party. So in that sentence, I'm actually doing something, making a promise, rather than saying something true or false. The sentence itself really has no truth value. The only thing we can say is that if I do go to your birthday party, that sentence satisfies the, quote, conditions of felicity. If I don't go to your birthday party, I've broken my promise, and that sentence would be infelicitous. So we can't then just close ourselves off from the world and prove the irrationality of the square root of 2 only in our cloistered minds. So Lentacker finds Austin useful here because Austin offers a picture of speech as performative, a, quote, theory of ritual whose efficacy is linked to a number of socio-historical as well as linguistic conditions. So there's a whole cast of characters to deal with to measure the felicities and infelicities of ordinary speech. Now, back to the Brodel example that Lentacker began with. The improvised prescription worked because there were felicitous conditions that made it work. He was mistaken for a real doctor. He was a man of a certain age, and he looked like someone who might be a doctor in a place of authority. It's hard to say if the prescription was true or false. What mattered were the serendipitous, quote, conditions of felicity that allowed his prescription to work. So now we can get to the second part of what graphic performativity is not. So Lentacker finds some limitations on the explanatory power of Austin because Austin's theory of performative speech acts is typically linked to oral performances. The prescription might need something else to explain it because prescriptions are not just oral performances. They're also things that are written down, and there's a kind of physical artifact that can remain after the performance. So there are a bunch of extra places where felicities and infelicities can happen because of this graphic preservation of the performance as an artifact. Right. So finally, in the last paragraph of the first section, we can finally get a good sense of what Lentacker means by graphic performativity. I think we have all the pieces now. And we can understand why this will be a useful concept to get us to see the complex history of the prescription as a performance. He spells it out in the first sentence of that paragraph. Quote, by graphic performativity, then, I refer to the ways in which the graphic artifact captures and transforms the powers of the oral performance as it is transcribed on paper. So, we'll need to keep in mind Austin's theory of speech as performance or doing something among a cast of characters, and we'll have to remember that there is paper here, right? And that paper will lead to some wacky shenanigans that complicate that doing. So we're skipping to the final section of the essay, titled The Scripting Act, because I just want to give you a broad overview of the argument right now without getting too far into the details. So it's a kind of forest for the trees situation right now. Again, I want this to serve as a model for how to approach these long academic essays that you might find overwhelming sometimes. Sometimes when you're reading these things, you'll actually do that. You'll lose the forest for the trees. So I think it's always a good idea to survey the whole landscape first to just get a lay of the land. And a good way of doing that is to do just what I did in this lecture, focus primarily on the first and last sections of the long essay before diving into all the details in the middle sections. So we know from the first section on graphic performativity that there's going to be discussion of a cast of characters, the physician, the pharmacist, and the patient, and all the wackiness, all the shenanigans that can follow from the written paper medium of the prescription. Now, what we learn in the concluding section on the Scripting Act is that there's a historical argument here as well. After all, Lentacker is a historian. That's his disciplinary charge. And he's interested in the phenomenon of change over time. So we get a sense of that change over time in the very first paragraph of the last section. He observes that there were a lot of changing, quote, conditions of felicity in Austin's sense around the Scripting Act, the performance of writing down and fulfilling a prescription. And then he makes an argument about that historical moment. Quote, "This became evident as ready-made drugs began displacing the custom-made." So the change over time is clearly presented here. Before, custom-made drugs were formulated specifically for individual patients, and after, ready-made drugs were prescribed not for individual patients, but for pre-packaged pathologies. And bonus, they were also advertised in mass media. So the relationship between physician and patient had changed, and the Scripting Act had to change as well, right? So we get the opinion of someone called Georges Dujardin-Beaumetz, one of the last physicians of the old order of individually formulated drugs. Now for him, every little detail of the Scripting Act was a calculated performance of authority to, quote, subjugate an admiring patient into compliance. The physician was the crafty manager who sometimes used really just fancy Latin phrases or impenetrable medical jargon to trick the patient into compliance. The doctor participated in a production of authority that was not really about recommending a drug that actually worked, but a ritual that reassured the patient that doctor knows best and everything will be okay. So Lentacker even gives us scenes, like outrageous scenes about physician hypnosis, in which the respected authoritative physician can merely suggest diseases into existence through that performance of respectability and that performance of authority. So all of that performative authority in the Scripting Act was in danger then once that authority was distributed and diluted through prepackaged, ready-made drugs that you could just pick up at the pharmacy. Dujardin-Beaumetz was afraid that authority would be undermined if physicians just started pointing patients to brand name drugs rather than drawing up, quote, beautiful prescriptions themselves with misleading Latin and sneaky tricks. It was a serious embarrassment then when the physician no longer wrote down prescriptions right from his massive brain, but had to reach for a drug manual to prescribe the appropriate treatment. Physicians were in a very different position. Physicians then had to adopt new protocols of dramaturgy. This is that performance language, dramaturgy, of staging the Scripting Act in the new age of ready-made drugs and mass media advertisement. Brodel, for example, mentions that you can still maintain authority by calculating the performance, by not answering questions before the prescription is written down, orally reciting the drug dosage and effects, and stylishly signing the prescription to symbolize how everything is just taken care of. So even though there's change over time, the rise of ready-made drugs and advertisement, the one constant in Lentacker's essay is the idea of the performance of the prescription. It was just the protocols of that performance that changed.